one of the things I noticed was the lack of contentment. It felt like what they had achieved, which to me was incredible, was never enough.
I'm 45 years old and midlife. It's a bummer. And while I have no interest in running out to buy a Porsche or jumping out of a plane, the existential questions around career and purpose are starting to kick in. Oh, and that other uncomfortable truth.
Death is an event, but dying is a process.
That's Erin Cochran, an expert on happiness in midlife. In this conversation, we discuss being behind on your finances and the shame that comes with it, pivoting your career into something more meaningful, and rediscovering your desires, passions, and aspirations. Let's jump in.
So let's start off with this question. How do you and your community define midlife?
Well, first of all, I say it's really a state of mind, which is an annoying answer for some people because I think when we endeavor to ask this question, we want clarity. But the truth is I do think it's a state of mind. When we started this conference, we had folks as young as 26 showing up and folks as late in the game as their late 70s. Who you would really consider sort of in their third chapter. And when I asked the 26-year-old, why are you here? He said, I'm preparing. And I think for the vast majority of folks, though, who are in those sort of core middle years of their 40s and 60s, and that's what I think we all really think of as middle age and the middle years, the common theme is the reluctance to admit that you're there. For folks who have been nervous about signing up, they felt that by admitting that they were in middle age, they were also aging. And isn't that interesting? Because we're all constantly aging, even when we're 9, even when we're 15, and when we're in our 20s, and we feel like, when we look back on it, we think, God, I look great. I had no idea and I didn't appreciate it.
And so this concept of aging, when do you, in your experience, when do people is midlife when you start to realize the actual downstream effects of aging?
I think you feel often like you're at that fork, right? And the question is whether you ignore it and you take a path or whether you continue down the same one you're in. And that really, I think, Khe, with your own personal experience with how you've pivoted in your career, you can think about it as whether you're going to change your job, for example, do what you really want to do. But for others, it may be that they're coming to the realization that the health issues that they've struggled with over the years, they're finally ready to grapple with them. And that's going to be hard work. For other people, it can mean facing the reality that they've not been able to or willing to take some really hard steps to save for retirement. And it's, again, that willingness to look in the mirror and say, I got to make a change because now I am in the middle. And if I don't change it now, when else will I? It'll almost be too late if I wait.
Yeah. Wow. So this idea that midlife, and again, I love how there's no age range for that. It's kind of when you choose to examine, right? Or when you choose to kind of turn the stones over, see what's below the stones. I think often of the Carl Jung quote, which said, until we make the subconscious conscious, it will dictate our lives, and we'll call it fate. And I feel like, and what I'm hearing in your definition of midlife is like, I'm done calling this fate. I'm like, I want to connect with these kind of underlying forces as scary as they might be. And so I'm wondering, you mentioned the 26 to folks in their 70s. Maybe if we just zoom out, you mentioned you had been having these conversations about with your friends and your peers about, I think you said careers, finances, health. What was that? There's one more?
Relationships.
And relationships. And I wonder, what were some of if you pull back, if you go a level deeper into those topics, what were do you remember some of the questions that you found to be the most moving?
The questions that I kept hearing friends grapple with, one was in health. For women, I really think that they reach that stage in their 40s where they're either firmly ensconced in perimenopause or they're about to or are going through menopause. And then if you're later in the game, you're in your 50s and 60s, you've gone through it. And that may have felt like a journey that you had no one to talk to about, felt shrouded in secrecy. And that was a conversation we were really actively having, my peers and I. The second one was seeing people's relationships change. And by that, I mean watching marriages dissolve. Yeah. And also watching people who had not yet paired up kind of wonder, will I ever? Do I want to at this place in my life? If you've lived alone and on your own for that long, like, is it possible to feel like you really could kind of merge your life with someone else?
Hey, quick time out. If you're watching this video, you're probably someone who thinks deeply and intentionally about your career, about your life, and about your relationships. But sometimes you might find yourself in a place feeling stuck, unmotivated, or just rudderless. If that's you, we have a coaching program for people looking to make a bold pivot and rediscover their aliveness. Just check out radreads.co/coaching. Now back to the video.
There's just a lot of financial stress because, as you know, as a father of 2, and I have 3 girls under the age of 10, you wonder, how could I ever save for college if that's what they want? It feels impossible. And so then we're also this sandwich generation. So, many of us are also dealing with aging parents. And so you think about the cost of your potential parents aging either in place or going into a nursing home. How in the hell are you going to pay for that and your kids' college tuition, let alone save for your vacation? So those were some of the things we were grappling with. And then the last I would say is, and this probably hits home for you, career pivots. Mm-hmm. The question around career pivots feels like it falls into a couple buckets. You have the one of the golden handcuffs. I make good money. It feels comfortable. I don't particularly love it. And in fact, some people feel like they dread it every day. Yep. But then they look at their financial reality and their responsibilities and they feel trapped. Mm-hmm. The other thing I find is friends who feel like they've been doing the same thing for a long time very much want to do something else, can even tell you what that thing is, but they're scared. Mm-hmm. And what's that fear about? Yeah. Is it fear of failure? Is it something from their childhood? Is it the fear of what their parents will think of their peers? Mm-hmm. Is it just starting over? And so all of these things, whether you're grappling with a relationship issue, a divorce, whether you're thinking about changing your career, the common theme seems to be that people feel alone in these struggles. Mm-hmm. Like they're the only ones going through them. And that's simply not true. Yeah. But I think the other thing that happened for us was we conceived of this conference last year. So in 2023, we were all 3 years out from the beginning of COVID. Many of us had gone back into sort of being social and living our lives again, but there had been this long period of isolation, a long time with our own thoughts, maybe too much. And I think there was a craving for community and a craving to solve these issues together, even with perfect strangers.
Yeah. Yeah. I reflect back that in my journey, so, I have not done many events or conferences. So for me, it's very much kind of a push approach where I share, I write, I make videos and people consume them and listen to them. But probably one of the most, the most poignant response that I get from people is, when you said this or when you wrote this, I felt less alone. And actually in the concept of aging, I talk a lot about, my hair looks good from this angle, but if you tilted the camera up by a few more degrees, it wouldn't look so good. And that's by design. And, it's something you talked about, the shame of aging. It's the shame of losing your hair as a man is pretty shameful in this society, or at least, at least that it felt that way to me. And it's funny because I've talked about it. I've talked about things like hiding Rogaine from my wife when we were dating, or, even ordering Rogaine on a different web platform so it wouldn't show up in the order history, things like that. And it's funny, I share this with, many men listen to this and their wives will say to me, my husband did that too. Because by the way, the wives always know, if you're trying to buy Rogaine from another e-commerce site, they're probably going to find out. But the comment that I would get both from the spouses and the men is oh, I thought I was the only person that felt that shame. And when you shared it, you know, it made me feel less alone. So I can imagine on this kind of plethora of issues, the impact that you have with people on that kind of question of aloneness.
This is personal for me too, because I lived and worked in Washington, D.C. for 20 years. And I felt like I was gaining ground and climbing the ladder career-wise in Washington in the annals of government. And I was working for a senator, and then I worked for a former secretary of state. And you're watching these incredibly ambitious and successful people. And you're standing next to them, sometimes handing them their talking points, shaping what they're going to say on stage, and then traveling with them. And you're with them in their downtime. And one of the things I noticed was the lack of contentment. It felt like what they had achieved, which to me was incredible and unattainable, was never enough. And I also say this is personal because I'm the daughter of a former college professor and a university president. And I often felt like with my father, everywhere he stepped on that ladder, it was just never enough. And so the lesson I've taken in my life from watching my dad and also watching some of the professionals that I've had the good fortune of working for was, I don't want to be like that.
Yeah.
It's okay to want success in your job, but there also has to be something deeper. And the question is, how do you find that clarity when you're with folks in those intense jobs like you had on Wall Street? And you look around and you think, is anybody else questioning this? Am I the only one? So I felt connected to your story also, Khe, about leaving Wall Street, walking away from it, and kind of thinking, am I the only person who's crazy enough to do this? You aren't, but it can feel that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, listening to you talk about your experience in politics, because as a New Yorker, and so, I mean, I pay attention to politics, but I don't really care about the sport of politics or the inside baseball of politics. It reminds me, Arthur Brooks, who wrote From Strength to Strength, which is a book I really enjoy, which actually touches on many, many of these themes. And I know many of our listeners have read it. Talks about, I think he calls it the four false idols. And it's fame, money, power, and pleasure. And, you know, so many of us, this kind of question of never enough, if you're chasing fame, there's always someone more famous than you. If you're chasing power, there's always someone more powerful with you. Same for money. And funny that I'll observe in my own experience, when I stepped off Wall Street, I kind of stopped chasing money. So I stopped chasing one of the idols. But the mind is so sneaky, and I kind of swapped it for fame, or what I would call kind of notoriety, right? Like thought leadership and so on. And I find it so interesting how just like a little jujitsu move, and you're like, well, I don't care about that thing anymore, but I care about this thing, which is also can lead you down this track of never enough. But let me ask you, so you saw these people who were unsatisfied, dissatisfied, you had experienced that kind of never enoughness through your seeing your father. What gave you the confidence in yourself to believe that you could kind of veer off into an unconventional path?
I just knew deep down that I was not happy. In fact, I felt deeply unhappy, unsatisfied. And so I kept asking myself, can I live this lie, really? That achieving and being associated with power would be enough for me? There's such traction in Washington, like there is in an industry like Hollywood, to feel important by who you're associated with. And in my case, I was working for Madeleine Albright, the first woman Secretary of State. And then prior to that, the Senate Majority Leader, Harry Reid. And it felt good to tell people that I worked for those people. Now, their success, I had nothing really to do with. They achieved those things. And so I knew that was hollow. And I think that gets back to, again, a theme from middle age, is being able to listen to your gut and trust it.
Yeah.
And it felt scary and lonely when I did walk away from it all. And it took time to get right with myself. And there are times when I go back to DC and it's like I can almost revisit the Erin of before.
Yeah.
I don't regret my decisions, but I think of that younger woman and I want to give her a hug and be like, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that that's what this midlife conference takes place the last weekend in October in a tiny little coastal town in Maine called Rockport, Maine. And nearly 150 people get together in a really intimate environment. And if you sign up for a midlife conference, you must be seeking something.
Yes.
So I think you should at least, I want to say to people who are coming, who are maybe even a little nervous, should I have signed up? You're clearly all in it together for something. You're looking and you're searching.
Yeah.
And so you have that commonality between each other.
That there is that selection bias of, by definition, I feel this with RadReads is if you read this, you're a seeker. You're not trying to become the next CEO of Goldman Sachs. I mean, maybe there is, but probably not, because I'm probably going to veer you more off the path for that than to accelerate that path. So I wanted to go back to, you had mentioned a few of the kind of salient questions that you kept hearing over and over again. I'd love to explore them
Absolutely.
deeper. One you mentioned is kind of this in midlife, and I'll speak from my own experience. Kind of 45, your kids stop needing you kind of every single minute of the day to buckle their car seats and so on. They have some independence. And, you've at that point, you might have been married for 10, 15 years. You may have known your spouse for 20 years at that point. And you start to see the fraying of the marriages, right? And I've been very transparent about in my own marriage where it's like, okay, so now what, right? We kind of made it to the other side of this kind of bomb shelter of survival mode.
Right.
We're older.
I love that.
There's, I think a lot of our unhealthy patterns, both as individuals, but also as a couple, feel like hardened. And, you get that breathing room where like, okay, the kids aren't taking every single moment of my life now. But this is I think one of the themes I've experienced with a lot of midlife questions, like, is this it? Is this how it's going to be for the rest of my life? Well, I took action with a job and in a marriage, we're like, we have these same fights. We have these same patterns that are unhealthy in certain regards. Are we just going to accept that this is how our marriage is going to be for the rest of our lives? Or are we going to step into it and try to change? And so I'm curious on that specific one, because I know from our audience, it's very, very common. I'd be curious, like, kind of what you've learned and how people navigate that part of midlife.
Oh my gosh. Kay, I'm so glad you brought this up. First of all, I've been married for 15 years and I have 3 kids, like I mentioned, that are 3 girls that are 10, 8, and almost 5.
Yeah.
And just like you, I sort of feel like we're kind of getting out of the insanity period. And I have had those moments, as I know my husband has, where we've looked at each other and we have not known what to do with an uninterrupted conversation. It feels like a muscle we haven't flexed.
Yep.
And so I think about 2 things. I think about, if we're going to be at this for longer together, now the first question I ask myself is, am I still curious about this person? Because at 10 to 15, 20 years, you can obviously feel like you know everything about them. You've already lived through a pandemic together with small children. It's like, what more could you not be tested by? And I still find him interesting and a little bit of a puzzle to me. And I realized that that was part of what attracted me to begin with, was that he was a bit of a mystery. So that's one thing. The second thing I think a lot about, and I think this goes for friendships too, is just that it is like a garden and you have to water it. And when we have small children, we're so distracted all the time by their moods, by their needs, by their schedules. And then sometimes I think we can use that distraction as an excuse to get away from the other thing between us and our partner. And so one simple thing we started doing was we stopped doing night dates because we found ourselves too tired. Go out to dinner, you have your glass or two of wine, and then you're like, I just want to go home and pass out.
Mm-hmm.
And we started doing day dates, something active, going on a hike, climbing a mountain, and something about that vitamin D, something about being in the outdoors. It felt like we were also discovering something new together.
Yeah.
Whereas dinner felt like we've done this for 15 years, going out to dinner.
Yeah.
Little tweaks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can relate to the night dates we just stopped. I think there's something, it's like a tired act,
Ugh.
right?
It is so
Especially if you live in a
middle-aged, you're like,
small
I'm
town.
tired.
Yeah. Live in
Yeah.
a small town, you've been in the same, we have good dining options, but you gotta drive to them. Yeah, there's something too about the moving your body while
Yeah.
you're engaging with someone. I think too, with us, thank you for sharing that. I think with one thing with us too was that we started to realize, this was also through a process of kind of going inwards as individuals, is that a lot of, like, we were bringing our childhood baggage to our marriage, right? And it wasn't even, it almost like had nothing to do with the other person. They were just catching kind of stray bullets of like the way a certain parent talked to you, or the insecurities you had as a teenage boy or girl. And and one thing that I've noticed in midlife is I feel like everyone's carrying that. And, I feel very lucky that I've gone on a kind of a journey of therapy and healing. And I would say just awareness of kind of what my patterns and conditioning have been. But then I can also see in others, like, oh, wow, like that's, that there's an angry kid, right there. There's a person whose emotional needs haven't been met. And again, I don't say that with any judgment, because I've been that person, and I am that person many times. And I wonder, how do you mentioned that, and feel free to broaden it up more expansively, but you get to these kind of salient questions like, my marriage is evolving. My friendships are not being maintained the way they're not what they used to be. I need to, I want to find happiness at work. How do you facilitate the, because these are a lot of things that there's no like right or wrong answer as well. How do you facilitate a setting, a conversation, exercises to get people to feel like they've made some progress on these questions?
Almost every one of the sessions that we host starts with providing some information and some intelligence really about a topic, and then it gets immediately interactive. So for the opening speaker this year, her name is Carrie Levine, and she's a certified nurse midwife and a functional medicine practitioner. But she's going to ask us we're each going to go through the arc of our lives to date. You're going to have a timeline in front of you, sheet of paper, and you're going to mark down for Kay, what were some of the most impactful moments health-wise for you from 0 to 45? And you might think, well, and maybe you've been really healthy, but then you forgot, oh my God, I had mono when I was a kid. Didn't seem like a big deal, but I wonder if it impacted me for the long run. I had Lyme disease for a short bit. I broke a leg and I never was quite the same on my ankle again. And then we're going to go through the job stuff. Start looking at some of the big job moments. We're the same with relationships. And the exercise itself, especially with just like a pencil on a piece of paper right there, requires you to look back in your life and go, oh my God, I forgot about that. Forgot how much impact that had on me, or that person did.
Yeah.
Now, do I need to carry that with me for the next chapter? Where do I want to go from here? And that's the question the opening keynote is going to ask us. Where are you now? And where do you want to go?
Yeah.
Because you are turning the page. You can, if you want to. And which of the things do you want to take with you on this journey? And which ones do you need to let go? I think about it as almost like you have a hold on the reins to a horse. And so on some of these memories from your childhood, your professional life, et cetera, do we need to just let it go? And there might be some work involved with that.
Yeah.
I think a lot about how I think my journey right now is to be a better listener. I think I'm often waiting for my turn to talk. Aren't we all to some degree?
Podcast host.
Podcast host, you have to. Let's give you a pass. I just think a therapist once told me that 90% of the reasons we get upset with the people we love is not what they say, it's how they say it. It's tone and delivery. And so I think now, especially with my kids, when they piss me off, it's not really what they said. It's just how bratty they were. And you think about it with your spouse or with your colleague.
Yeah.
Isn't what they said. Maybe they're condescending. And how do I show up in that way?
Yeah.
This year, we're having a session that I think for a New England community will really test the boundaries of the comfort zone. And it's going to be a conversation around the role of psychedelics in midlife.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a woman named Jessica Witten, based in Portland, Maine. And she was 20 years as a talk therapist and sort of reached a juncture in her career where she thought, I just don't know if talk therapy is as effective as I thought it could be. There's got to be another way. And so now she treats people with PTSD with ketamine.
Yeah.
And she told me that it has had profound impacts. And it needs to be shaped with therapy, talk therapy along with it. And it's been interesting as I've teased it out on social media for folks, and if I have had one-on-one conversations with prospective ticket buyers, you either get immediately, whoa, that makes me uncomfortable, I don't want to partake in it. Or I'm fully bought in, I used to be a fish fan.
Yeah.
And there's nowhere in between. And that reaction makes me think of my own self, how I've long been a pretty black and white person. And so how can I come at things with more curiosity?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean I don't have pause and I wouldn't question, but where can I live in the gray zone a little bit more comfortably?
Yeah.
I'm not there yet.
That insight that the therapist had is something that I've noticed in my own life, where I've done about, I didn't talk to anyone for 35 years. And then I would say the last 8 or 9 years, I've done a lot of different types of talk therapy and coaching, getting coached. And this year, something broke open where I'm like, I don't want to sound like a know-it-all, but I've done so much talk therapy that I can talk about all of my issues very clearly. I'm like, well, I'm this way because, this is a relationship I had as a child. I'm this way because, I felt, overlooked when I was a teenager. I'm this way because I have this fear of death that has kind of hung over my head. And my wife and I actually did a guided psychedelics therapeutic together, like as part of marriage therapy, which is a whole nother,
wow.
There's an episode on that. So I'll put in the show notes and
I want to listen to that one.
But it's beyond what I found, and this could be helpful for the conference, is that there's also a lot of modalities that are in the body that don't involve psychedelics. So whether it's breath work, I've been in different breath work settings where it's kind of like there's a re-engagement with just intense emotion, usually negative, just from changing the way you just breathing in and out of your mouth for an hour, like fast.
Wow.
Like it just like triggers different parts of your nervous system. Another one that's been really, really impactful for me has been internal family systems, which is a modality of therapy that goes by IFS, where I'm like, sounds like I'm like you in that, very kind of left-brained, but it has you just kind of talk to sensations in your body, like talk to this pain in my chest, talk to this tightness in my knee, and my calf. And then what happens is they talk back, but you've kind of left the rational, like you're talking to your calf in your head. You've kind of left the rational programming that we're pretty accustomed to, and very, very unique things emerge. Like all of a sudden you're talking to this, baby version of you. You're talking to this creatively stifled part. So that there might be a way to bridge the gap from, ketamine to talk therapy with some things in between.
Kay, I'm thinking as you're talking about how you have two qualities that I think I wish I could imbue in all middle-agers. One is an innate curiosity. You clearly, like you've tried so many, in this case, so many types of therapy. You're not, doesn't mean maybe you didn't have any fear about any of them, but you were willing to just try something
Mhm.
new. I think the second thing is your introspection. You've said a couple of times in this conversation already, I know that I'm not good at this or I could be better at that. I think that's another thing. And maybe it's very American too.
Mhm.
We don't like to admit what we're not good at.
Mm.
Fear of failure,
Yeah.
fear of vulnerability. And
Mhm.
I think by the time you get to this middle stage in life, haven't we all had enough? We've been knocked down enough. And maybe we've gotten back up. So let's just talk about it.
Mhm.
One of the things
Yeah.
I felt in all those years and listening to people on stage in Washington, D.C. at political conferences was there's really nobody who ever got up there and said, I had extraordinary fear that I wouldn't be good at this job
Mhm.
until honestly Michelle Obama came around. And I felt like she was so real. And that's why people love her.
Yeah. Yeah.
She's led an extraordinary life, but she was also an ordinary person for a really long time. And she was able to be honest, even when she was in the White House, about the things that she feared,
Yeah.
about whether she wouldn't be a good mother, whether she could actually impact any change and the issues that she cared about. We
Mm.
need more of that vulnerability in our leaders.
Yeah.
We really do. We need it
Mm.
in ourselves.
Yeah. Thank you so much for, it feels, it's very nice to be seen that way. So
Mm,
I appreciate you saying that. I'd love to pivot to some of the financial questions, right? Because I feel,
mhm,
the audience here is definitely much more of a professional, and so they're kind of, I would say more are on track with their financial goals. Diligently putting in the 529s, investing into
okay.
529s, and so on. But at the same time, I think we're in a moment in time where just everyone, whether it's have to the litany of economic forces that are, whether it's inflation or white collar jobs shrink, just
Mhm,
there's so many different things, home prices. How have you seen, and you have a different community body
mhm,
than the listeners here, but I think still the same kind of questions where there's a place where I should be financially and I'm not there, and it could be
mhm,
retirement, it could be kids savings. In many regards, I think when you're young, when you're pre midlife, you have time on your side. You can kind of catch up, right? You can save more. You can kind of let the markets work for you, or you can cut your spending and up your savings and investing and so on. But as you get closer, in midlife, your kids are 6 years from college, 5 years from
okay.
college, or you're 10 years, you're a decade from retirement. And so can you tell us a little bit more about the folks that feel behind in
Mm.
financial goals?
The number one issue I see regarding financial wellness or lack thereof in midlife is shame.
Mm.
So many people feel shame because everyone, whether you feel financially strong or not, feels like somebody else has done it better than them.
Yeah.
But because we have
Awesome.
no discourse around money and it's all kind of mysterious how much you have, how much I have, and we make judgments on each other based on what we see physically, right? And the transactions that maybe we witness you make, the vacations you take, the cars you drive, that we don't talk about it. So it is shrouded in mystery. So what I saw last year, we had a very open dialogue around money shame, and we plan on doing it again this year because we felt like there was so much richness to unpack.
Mm.
Because you almost have two camps. You have people who do have money, either because they came into it, they were lucky, they worked hard for it, they managed it well. They feel some shame around the fact that they have it. And the questions become, how do I talk about this wealth with my children? How do I make sure it doesn't dissipate or go away at some point? And how do you deal with it with friends who clearly probably don't have what you have?
Yeah.
And then the other question becomes that for folks who feel like, oh my God, I haven't saved, I can't save, it's too late. And, every financial advisor will tell you it's not too late. And you're like, bullshit, I don't believe you.
Mhm.
And again, as I'm saying this, you can think of somebody in your life on either spectrum.
Yep.
Again, I'm not alone. We have to
Mhm.
talk about these things.
Yeah. I am curious because I do sometimes I feel like I lack empathy with the folks who are behind because I've been so prudent. And I will talk about my shame because I had shame when I grew up lower middle class.
Mm.
And so I had a lot of shame because we didn't have money or we didn't show like we
Mhm.
didn't behave like we had money. That's a fair like. And then on the other side of it, now I have shame that I have money and that a lot of these worries that many Americans and peers have, I just don't have them for myself. And so there's shame on the
Mhm.
other side of it. And so it's I can very clearly see both, but I am still kind of curious. I'm curious I'm behind on this, and there is the clock is ticking, so to speak. Is there what are some ways that people kind of right size the ship in those situations without
Well,
diving into the hardcore financial
yeah.
advice?
Well, I want to say one thing, which is there was a woman at the conference last year on the money shame piece who raised her hand, and she was very honest. She said, I married someone who has a ton of money. I really didn't have any. And he's much older than me. And so he is going to die not too long from now, and I'm going to inherit all of his wealth. And I have so much shame about the fact that I did not earn a penny of this. This is not, I don't see it as my money. What was amazing to me was her willingness to share that story.
Yeah.
And then what was interesting was the sort of faces in the crowd. And you could, I think, unfortunately, see that people didn't have any empathy for her because and I heard people on the sidelines thereafter say, well, I wish I had her problem.
Yeah.
But what we could really, if we had had a one-on-one session with her, we could have unpacked wasn't just the shame around the money. It was also about being a woman and inheriting money from a man. It was about the age difference. There was a lot in there.
Yeah.
And that, I think, has to be resolved almost two ways. It's like financial advisor plus therapist, right?
Yeah.
To let go of that. And what she was really facing was, what am I going to do with all this money?
Yeah.
Can I be beyond doing it for me and my children? Like, is there something, I think she wanted to be quote unquote productive philanthropically.
Yeah.
But how do you have that conversation when you don't feel like you have peers to have it with?
And even in that case, the peers were kind of sidebarring on the situation. Yeah. And I'm even thinking it maybe answering my own question in like, I can imagine that someone that feels behind and someone who might feel similarly behind and others who are ahead, so to speak, there's probably some kind of mind melding where it's like something that might seem very obvious to the person who's financially savvy. That's like, oh, you could, get a HELOC or something. And the person who feels behind is like, oh, I never realized that there's this concept of taking equity out of your home. And so I'm actually better off. Like I might have a very low bank balance and my kids might have a very low college, whatever. And that's like, but I actually have this source of wealth that I didn't even know was one that I could use. Or maybe someone else would say, you don't, many schools offer extremely generous financial aid packages. So your goal isn't to pay for the whole college tuition. Your goal is to get smart about the financial aid options that exist for your child and do the best you can with that. I could see that kind of occurring in a collaborative scenario, an environment where the shame and the guilt and the embarrassment kind of are like peeled away.
It starts with, I think, for the folks who have not saved money for whatever reason, it starts with saying, I haven't saved any money. I'm really panicked about it. And I do want to take action. But it has to start with admitting where you are.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really thought about on the money shame conversation was how oddly familiar it was to me actually around sex education. And follow me for a second, in the sense that we have no financial literacy in really almost any of our schools, whether you say it's a private or public school. It's really upon us as parents to educate our children about how to save money, the value of money. I think we obviously should and do play an important role in that regard, but there could be a role for the schools. And similarly, you think about sex education in America, it's woefully behind and inept. And so again, upon us as parents. But instead of saying, well, it sucks, you could do something about it. I thought often in the panel on money shame, for those who felt really behind and felt extraordinarily worried, what it would take for them to walk into their local bank and just say, I really have next to no savings and I need a financial advisor. Can you offer me someone?
Yeah.
But that act of admitting that you have quote unquote failed, because that's what people feel, I failed, can also just be the barrier to fixing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And isn't that the case with so many other issues?
Yeah. You're so spot on. Feeling seen, feeling encouraged, removing that level of shame, having others around you prod you, even for that tiniest bit of agency, can be transformative to people. You know, and go ahead.
Well, just the idea that you and your wife on the other topic said, we're going to go down a path of exploring therapy together, but in a new way. You first had to admit that you wanted to do therapy as a couple, which we still have a lot of cultural shame around. Which is absurd. And you think about if you're going to be together 40, 50 years, my God, to not go through couples therapy, everybody needs a tune-up regularly. I think it's like the garden analogy. Everybody needs to water their garden. And couldn't we all get better, for example, about our finances? And so being able to ask for help requires of us to get over the hump of just saying we need it and admitting that to ourselves.
And that's where the power of these communities, where people are there supporting each other without judgment, you know, similar enough, but also different. I can imagine it would I could just feel the transformative effect. I'd love to pivot onto another topic around mid-age, which is, it feels like, you know, you mentioned the sandwich generation, but it feels like in that window, 40 to 60, let's just use a classic definition, you start to experience loss. Whether it's parents, I would say at this point, every one of my peers has lost someone at an age too young, you know, car accident, some cancer, like and I suspect that, you know, we've established that we are not great at financial literacy. We're not great at sex literacy in this country. And one thing we're damn sure not good at is, let's call it debt literacy. That's probably not the right framing of it. I'm curious, in your conversations, in your communities, and in your events, what is the discussion about mortality?
This year, we're hosting a session called "The One Thing We All Have in Common Is We're All Going to Die Someday. So let's have a dialogue about it." And it's led by a woman, as you can tell, with a great sense of humor, named Laura Clemenson, who's a death doula and a hospice volunteer. And she has a wonderful TED Talk everyone can find online. And it really maps the journey of her facing her mother receiving a terminal illness diagnosis and her mother being completely ready to grapple with her mortality. And yet Laura, watching her mother with 3 months to live, saying, I'm not ready to deal with this. What's going to happen when my day comes? And she got curious, really curious, and she decided to found a group called the Pre-Dead Social Club.
Cool.
Based out of New Hampshire, it's about bringing people together in community, often strangers or friends of friends who are ready to have conversations about death and dying. Laura likes to say that death is an event, but dying is a process. Dying, that process, is the thing we're not prepared for, because we in America think about the forms we need to fill out. Who's going to get all our stuff? Who's going to take care of the kids? But what happens if you become a vegetable? What do you want that to look like? And who are your caregivers and caretakers? And I don't know about you, but I know my parents are completely, really unwilling to have this conversation with me. And so what do you do in that respect? How do you get your parents to talk to you about it? So Laura is going to lead us through a few interactive sessions where we explore those issues in community together.
Oh, wow. I think it's beautiful. We actually had a death doula on the podcast as well, because this is a topic I think about and write about a lot. And just a fun fact or a fun, interesting tidbit on the topic of death. In my prior podcast years ago, I interviewed Frank Ostaseski, who is he runs the Meta, I forgot exactly, the Zen Hospice Project. So it's a network of hospices that are kind of centered around the principles of Buddhism. And so he's tended to thousands and thousands of deaths over his lifetime. And he mentioned that there's a lot of shame in dying. So the question of shame comes up again, the topic of shame. And people on their deathbed or in the process of dying feel like they're not dying well. Right? They're being a burden to others. Their needs are so much. The way they are acting is not copacetic with how they think they should be dying. And so it just, as you were saying, they're also, it feels like all these topics are so intertwined, with shame being kind of a recurring theme through it. But I was just like, can you imagine getting to the end and then still beating yourself up? For like, I'm not doing this dying thing like as well as, Joe did it, over there.
Right. That is, gosh, that feels like the crux of everything right there. Yeah. I'm glad. And I want to know, why do you feel like you think about this topic a lot?
Yes. I suspect that there is a lot of that I have some intergenerational trauma arising from my dad escaping the Cambodian genocide. And so that's kind of the clinical version that I'll give you. But I think for me, I think that when I was young, I had this nightmare that probably when I was 10 or so, and it was this very kind of scientific. I'm a very science-oriented person. It's a very scientific nightmare, which basically posed a question when I was probably like 8, which said, if time is infinite and UK are finite, what happens like for infinity once you're gone? Which is kind of like a very perplexing, it's a very impossible scientific question. It's a question that probably has more grounding in spirituality or religion and so on. But that was a question that it manifested in the form of a visual nightmare. And so that I've had that since I was probably 8 years old. I haven't had that nightmare recently. I didn't really have it as an adult. And so from there, I realized that like, I thought that death was this like really bad thing that should be fought off at all cost.
Like a battle.
Like a battle, yeah, exactly. And it's a kind of a very Western way of seeing death. And, it's like, don't like the way your face looks, get Botox. Like, don't like, you look at these longevity, I call them longevity nut jobs, like the people that are, drinking other people's blood and like, plasma and putting plasma, replacing their ketchup with placebo or whatever. I just like, I'm like, wow. I think I used to be, I was too young to actually act upon those things, but that was the mindset that I had. It's like, any tool that I have at my disposal to push off death, I'm going to use it. And that's something I internalized at a very young age, probably like around a teenager. And so in my 20s, when I started to have resources and started to have a lot of agency in my own life, I said to I was like, okay, like this is the time. I even thought about things like, I have a small heart condition that's completely doesn't impact me, but I like the thought ran through my head. It's like, well, what's the best cardiology center in America? Should I start donating money to them so that if this heart thing ever becomes problematic, I'll be able to skip the line at, Mount Sinai or whatever. So those were like the kind of thoughts that were, that I was having in my 20s and maybe early 30s. If you could imagine the amount of suffering that's behind all those thoughts.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's like a losing. That's why now when I see the longevity nut jobs, I'm like, I just want to give you a hug. Like, I know what it feels like to want to stave this event off at any cost. And so that was kind of how I kind of landed in it. And then the coaching and the therapy and the spirituality kind of was like, well, what is it really, what is it that you're really afraid of? And I'll give you the TLDR, but I think I actually wasn't, what I was really grappling with was the death of the ego, which is like, at some point
Oh.
you don't matter. That was more painful than time being infinite, or, even like losing loved ones. Like at some point, you don't matter. Right. And I think that led me down a path where it's like, well, what is mattering? Is mattering the thing we should be centered on anyway? Like, are there alternative perspectives? Is there an alternative lens on mattering? Maybe it's love or service or whatever. And so that nightmare, from 8 years old on, kind of kickstarted this kind of domino effect, daisy chain of, a lot of suffering that then kind of turned into healing. And now I do think about dying pretty regularly, and not in like a creepy, nihilistic way, but more just like,
Hmm.
like I do think about, if I woke up tomorrow with a terminal diagnosis, like how would I feel about my life? And like, I would be extremely sad. But at the same time, I don't have many regrets. Like I'm living the life that I want to live. So at least like that burden's been lifted.
Hmm. I'm also wondering with surfing if in some way it forces you to think about death a lot. I don't know
Mm,
how crazy your surfing is.
yeah, not that crazy. But I think you're right. I think that there is, I think stillness forces me to think
Mm.
about death. And yeah, as we were talking earlier about just like, oh, the busyness of parenting, I saw this beautiful, I'll send this to you and put it in the show notes, but there's this beautiful essay, Anne Lamott writes these incredible essays on aging in the Washington Post. So
Mm.
if anyone just wants to, if you just Google Anne Lamott, Washington Post, but she had one where she said that the bumblebee, like a bee, if you put if there are bees in a mason jar, you don't actually need to put a cap on them because they won't fly out because they're so busy being busy. So they don't actually like look up. And I was just thinking like that's such an apt metaphor for whether it's like a career in politics or Wall Street, or
Mhm.
the logistics of having 3 kids under the age of 10. It's like you're not even trapped. You just haven't stopped to look up.
It might be. I know we're getting close to time, and this might be
Yeah.
a good place to wrap it. Where I will share that at last year's opening keynote for the Midlife conference, a gentleman named Philip Francis, who runs an away program. I would say it's like a study abroad program. Um, he asked us all to ask ourselves, when was the last time you thought about your desires?
Hmm.
And your desires could be lots of different things, right? And he said, write down how old you were when you really thought about them. And what I found profoundly heartbreaking was that a lot of the women in the audience said they couldn't recall the
Hmm.
last time they had thought about their desires. So Philip's call to all of us was, well, now's the time to start. Because if
Hmm.
you haven't been in tune with yourself up till now, for whatever reason, caregiving, busyness, as you said, now's the time to check in with yourself and get right with yourself.
Beautiful. Well, Erin, that is the perfect way to end this lovely conversation. And yeah, I just want to thank you. I mean, this is so powerful, and the work that you are doing up in the Northeast is just a beautiful reminder that we're not alone, and
Mhm.
that many people are there both to see one another, and also support one another. And I think it's just it's not like we started. Midlife is not the sexiest. Most midlife events are aimed at conquering it, or keeping it at bay. But to embrace it is, I think it's what a lot of us need. And so that's
Thank
awesome.
you for
Thank you.
shining light on it, Kate. And thank you for being really an example of what vulnerability can do for you. I think Your ability to be introspective is something we can all do more of ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. And where can people go find out more about the conference? We'll put it all in the show notes and description.
People can go to themidlifeconference.com, and they can find us on Instagram at the Midlife Conference as well.
Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Kay.